People are sick and livestock is dying.
We need to take action now.
I want action against pollution too, but what exactly is pollution? And why does government always go too far?
Would give the EPA unprecedented authority.
Another big power grab for the EPA.
The EPA has become the green monster, a monster that tramples on our lives.
You're a monster.
That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
The green monster. That doesn't sound fair. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has created rules that made the environment cleaner. When I was in college, the air and water were filthy. People forget how bad it was, so let me remind you. Here's the star anchorman of my day reporting on the state of America.
The fouled skies, the filthy waters, the littered earth.
Hydrocarbons, metal fumes, organic matter, odors and malodors on each and every day.
Okay, some of that was media hype. There's always media hype. But in truth, much of America was still pristine. But it's also absolutely true that in many cities, near industrial plants, the air was just filthy. It's much cleaner now. So is the water. Even here, within sight of the Empire State Building, within a short distance of millions of people flushing, I'm willing to do this. Thanks, EPA. You've required sewage treatment plants and catalytic converters on cars. Good work. Now, in a rational world, the EPA would now say, stick a fork in it. It's done. But bureaucracies never say they're done. Done means bureaucrats are out of work. Can't have that. So even though the air and water are much cleaner now, the politicians keep adding new rules. And then they applaud themselves for doing that.
I am really proud of President Obama for these new EPA regulations and for the strong stands that he has taken on climate change at home.
Another person who's happy with the new EPA rules, in fact, he wants more, is Daniel Weiss of the League of Conservation Voters. Not so happy is environmental law professor Jonathan Adler. So, Jonathan, why not? You don't want a clean environment?
Of course I want a clean environment, but we make the mistake sometimes of assuming that the way you clean the environment is just adding another regulation.
Yeah, Daniel, isn't it enough already?
Well, first, I don't hear anybody complaining that things are too clean. In fact, millions of Americans still live in metropolitan areas where the air is can cause respiratory ailments and trigger asthma attacks. Second, we've got a lot of water that needs to be cleaned up. Third, we really need to deal with climate change, which is a global problem, but we have to start here at home by reducing the carbon pollution responsible for climate change.
But you confuse a lot of things there. You talk about pollution and climate change. I think they're different. There's confusion about what pollution and carbon pollution really mean. When I think of pollution and carbon, I think of this stuff, coal. You burn this and you get filthy soot in the air. This is real pollution. Touch this, it's just filthy on your fingers. But the new rules against carbon dioxide, that's something else. We exhale carbon dioxide. It's good there's plenty in the air. Plants need it to grow. Is it correct to call carbon dioxide pollution? I don't think so, but the protesters mix everything together.
Carbon pollution, yuck. Yeah, it's your turn.
Carbon pollution, yuck.
Clean energy, that's the way.
Clean energy, that's the way.
Here we go, together. Carbon pollution, yuck.
Am I unfair in saying that they're just confused?
Well, I think it is fair to say that a lot of people assume that when we talk about climate change, we're talking about traditional pollution. I think it's also fair to say that nothing that the EPA has put on the table for climate change will actually do anything to affect the global warming that we're concerned about. The EPA's own cost-benefit analyses don't really identify any benefits.
They admit at this point it would have no effect.
Right. If we're serious about dealing with climate change, we need to reduce per capita emissions of carbon dioxide to the level they were during the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Yeah, Daniel, how's that going to happen to make a difference?
Well, first of all, you can't address a problem instantaneously. We have to start by having the United States, which has put the most carbon pollution into the atmosphere, reduce its carbon. Once we've done that, then we need to get other countries to get them to reduce their carbon pollution
Good luck with that.
And in fact, may I finish, please? And in fact, one of the things that's happened is since the administration made its Clean Power Plan proposal a month ago, other countries are now starting to indicate that they too are going to do more to reduce their pollution.
I'll believe it when I see it. But Daniel, here's a commercial that your group runs that criticizes people like Jonathan who attack the new EPA rules.
Their attacks are baseless fear-mongering, false, bogus, and flunked a truth test. They pollute our air, and they pollute the airwaves with lies, blowing smoke to protect their profits.
You're polluting the airways with lies.
Well, I certainly don't know why I could be accused of that. I mean, we certainly all care about the environment. I certainly think climate change is a problem. But the reality is the United States, China, Germany...
You think it's a problem?
I think it's a problem, but it's not a problem that justifies regulating the entire economy. It's the sort of thing that has to result out of innovation and entrepreneurship, and that's not something the EPA encourages. And it's the sort of thing we actually need.
Sorry.
Let's go back to the pollution.
Not a single cleanup. May I finish? Not a single cleanup has occurred of any major pollutant due to voluntary measures. Innovation is driven by regulation. Right now, putting pollution in the air is free. So why, if you're a utility, would you ever develop a perhaps slightly more expensive way to address that when putting the pollution in the air is free?
He's certainly right. The EPA. The environment is one area where my beloved free market won't just solve things. We need some, and we've had great success. We have this chart of how air pollution is down. But then you provided this chart, which shows how it was falling even before the EPA.
Exactly.
What did we lost? Sulfur dioxide. What happened?
Well, there was technological change and improvement driven by the desire to be more efficient. There were also
driven by the Clean Air Act of 1990.
Forced it.
There were also state and local rules that both, in some cases, regulated the emissions, and in some cases...
But it was dropping faster before the EPA regulated.
It was. But the reality is, as everyone has acknowledged who's done work on this, sulfur dioxide concentrations in the ambient air were declining before the EPA was created.
Why?
Well, because local communities cared about their air quality, number one, because in some cases companies could be liable for lawsuits if they were polluting their neighbors. And in some cases we realized that the more stuff that's going out your smokestack, that's material that you're wasted. That means you're paying more for your inputs.
So out of selfish reasons they were cleaning up.
In some cases it was selfish reasons, and in some cases it was state and local governments telling them that they had to do better for their local communities.
Daniel,
you know what that is completely
says,
revisionist, made-up history. Let me just read you a quote. Let me let you know how well Jonathan Adler knows about things.
Here. I have a question for you. You have every chance to address this here. He says, many people say that the stuff we're doing now to try to address climate change is going to make no difference and cost a fortune. What's the point?
Well, first of all, it doesn't cost a fortune. Second of all, it will drive innovation. And Jonathan was completely telling fairy tales when he described how state and local governments on their own with happy companies led to a decline in pollution. It was only driven by the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other laws that set the standards and let the states implement it. That's what drives innovation, not the good nature of people running things. So state governments just are
in the tank and they won't get it done without the big feds?
That's right. And remember, what the EPA is doing now is implementing a law passed by the Congress and interpreted by the John Roberts Supreme Court that said that carbon pollution is a pollutant covered by the Clean Air Act. So all that EPA is doing is enforcing the law. If Congress doesn't like the law, they can try and change it. But until then, EPA is not doing this on their own. They're doing this because they're following a decision by the Supreme Court and the laws of the United States.
What if the law says I can't exhale and exhale carbon dioxide?
Can I finish, John? Jonathan just said something.
You talk so much. It's hard to let you finish. I mean, they're regulating carbon dioxide. We exhale that.
Right, and you know what? If I put you in a room with nothing but carbon dioxide, you wouldn't live very long, would you? Now, the reality is, Jonathan just made a very spurious charge, which is that efforts to reduce pollution actually end up hurting people. Yes. But you know what? In 1997, he said the same thing. And in fact, since he said that in 1997, our mortality rate in the U.S. is down by 8%.
Jonathan, you get to reply. I assume it's for other reasons.
Well, I mean, it is certainly due to other reasons. The National Academy of Sciences, for example, has repeatedly pointed out that our efforts to deal with ozone pollution by the EPA in some cases actually increase local air pollution. The EPA has acknowledged that some of its recent regulations trying to encourage greater use of biofuels actually increase air pollution.
It's just a crony capitalism scam.
But
look, they've done great things. Acid rain, the ozone hole, some regulations needed, right?
If the EPA were more focused on those areas where the federal government has a unique ability to deal with problems, such as interstate air pollution, such as what it did with lead and gasoline, there wouldn't be so many complaints about it.
Thank you, Jonathan and Daniel. We're out of time on this. Where do you fit in this debate? You, I assume, want clean air. I'm sure I do. I'm open to the possibility that climate change is something we may need to address. And watching TV, you'd think even that would be easy. We're told we can change the world for the better just by buying the right car.
We've built the only car you'll ever need. It's electric, sure, and it might just change the world. This is Chevrolet Volt.
Sounds so good, but David Harsani says we're being tricked. What do you mean?
Well, the Chevy Volt can't change anything because we only sell a few thousand of them each year. That's first off. Secondly, if people actually paid what a Chevy Volt cost to make, it would probably be around $200,000. So without government, essentially government cronyism and all kinds of subsidies, the Volt wouldn't exist, A, and B, even if you use it, you're probably using electricity that is run on coal anyway, so you're not really helping the environment very much.
And they still lose $49,000 on every Volt they build?
That's one estimate, yeah, even higher on some estimates.
This is what, in my consumer reporting days, we called a scam.
Yeah, and it's happening with energy, all kinds of alternative energies that are subsidized, hurting other industries, also companies that rely on government subsidies. So they actually are hurting companies that actually have some innovation that might work better.
But the government decides, this company is good. We'll give you a special break.
Especially if you lobby them a lot. The people who lobby and have the closest ties to government are typically the ones who benefit from the subsidies the government gives.
How much has Solar City Corporation got?
It's hard to tell, but tens of millions. Every administration does this. The closer you are, you have the ear of the people who control the purse strings, and you win.
Mostly Democrats. Loans went to companies with ties to Harry Reid, Al Gore, Bill Richardson, one former Republican, Angus King. He's now in the Senate. It's a bad way to practice capitalism. It's crapitalism.
Absolutely. I mean, it's unhealthy for government to act that way because it leads to corruption quite often. Moreover, it's bad for capitalism because you're hurting companies that don't have the benefit of lobbyists and of the ear of Washington, and then they have to suffer.
At least Solar City is still in business. There are 19 companies that got government money, your money, taxpayer money, and they're bankrupt if you look at this list.
Right.
But the government would say, well, these are experiments. We got to subsidize these newcomers.
Isn't it funny that in almost every other industry, take televisions or anything, we don't have subsidies and we zoom ahead. And in the industry where we're moving forward with progressive ideas like windmills and solar panels, which have been around, by the way, for many, many decades, consumers are not winning. It's just more expensive. So that argument...
It's been like 20, 30 years now these subsidies have been going out.
Of course, and a lot of this so-called technology has been around since, windmills have been around since the Middle Ages, actually.
Thank you, David. To keep this conversation going, please use that hashtag EPA. Let us know what you think. Coming up, EPA bosses spending 2 to 6 hours a day watching porn and defecating in the hallways. Your tax dollars at work. But next, a little guy fighting back against the green monster. In Wyoming, a farmer had the nerve to put a small dam or a stream on his property so he could have a pond. It worked out. The wildlife like it.
Now you can see bald eagles here. We have moose come down. 4 and 5 pound brown trout live in this. It's just been a tremendous environmental benefit.
Great. Maybe you want to do something like that, but you better not, because even if you think your property is your property, in America today, it's not.
The fact that you own it doesn't matter. Cross the EPA's bureaucrats and the green monster may smash through your wall. Better hope the monster doesn't take notice and focus his wrath on you.
That was the Incredible Hulk, and in many ways, the EPA is kind of like that green monster, and now the monster has focused its wrath on Andy Johnson. Johnson's the Wyoming man who owns that small farm. You built a pond. Why?
Well, we wanted to provide stock watering for our horses and cows, improve our property, and provide an environmental benefit as well.
And to build a pond means a dike, means you're diverting water that might have gone to somebody else, right?
Well, actually, our pond is designed to where we have a spillway and it comes up to a certain level and then it just automatically dumps over. We don't regulate it at all, so we're not actually blocking the water.
So you go to your state environmental officials and you get permission?
Yeah, I went to the state engineer's office right there locally, then we sent off a stock pond permit through the state of Wyoming to the Cheyenne office, and when we got the permit back, we began to start our project.
And we checked, and he's right, the state engineer's office says the permit is in good standing and entitled to be exercised, exactly as permitted. So you do, and then the feds come in suddenly, and you say what?
Well, Mr. Johnson, you may or may not be in violation, but you need to prove to us that you are not.
In violation of what?
The Clean Water Act. And the funny part about that is my water that leaves my property out of the pond is actually 41 times cleaner than the alleged navigable water that I've affected, so they say.
The EPA gave you 30 days to dismantle the pond.
Yes.
I'm not sure how you do that.
Physically impossible.
Said there might be fines of $187,500 per day.
It's extortion. There's, I don't know any other way to say it. It's just ridiculous.
Now, most people just cave. You can't fight the government. You can't afford the lawyers. You going to cave?
No, sir. We're going to fight them all the way. I have legal foundations that are backing me up.
The EPA sent us a statement. Mr. Johnson's construction of a dam was done in violation of a well-known and well-established Clean Water Act permitting process.
No, the state never informed me of any other federal permit that I needed, and I went through all the hoops that the state of Wyoming required in order to build this. I asked all the neighbors, all the locals. It turns out I'm one of the very, very few that even has a state permit.
And he's not lying about the state. We got a note from the governor of his state today. Mr. Johnson constructed his pond appropriately. The actions of the EPA have been heavy-handed. They want to expand their authority, he says, and you get the brunt.
Yeah, they want to take over all jurisdiction on private property throughout the United States. I think they're using me as a test case.
The EPA now says it may adjust its rule and increase the amount of land over which it has jurisdiction. That's upset some landowners, and one farming family who had heard the EPA sometimes labels ditches and dried up riverbeds wetlands, which must be preserved, made this protest video to the tune of the Oscar-winning song Let It Go.
That's enough, that's enough. The EPA and the Corps, they will try to justify, but we won't back down. Don't need more government anyway.
So, Andy, at least you have some company out west fighting them.
Absolutely.
And this idea that they show the canoe in a dry ditch, does this resonate?
They want to be in charge of every drop of water that hits the earth. Let it be off your roof, let it be in a rain barrel. Who knows where the end is on this.
Well, thank you, Andy. You're not alone, and you're fighting this. I wish you the best of luck. Coming up,
thank you.
Myths, lies, and complete stupidity about America's search for energy.
Oklahoma has had more than 100 earthquakes since Friday. Today's only Monday.
President Obama, ban fracking now!
Wells have been ruined and people are sick and livestock is dying.
Genetic mutation of our children.
genetic mutation of children. My goodness, people are really upset about fracking, that process where energy companies inject chemicals into the ground and break up oil and break up rock to release oil and gas. And the frackers do use some dangerous chemicals and might spill them. State regulation's supposed to prevent that, but the protesters want much more. Bans, and they also want the EPA to step in, and that seems reasonable in a way, one federal rule instead of all these different state regulations. But Steve Everly, who works for oil and gas companies, says putting the EPA in charge would be a threat to all of our future?
The boom that we're having in oil and gas is largely on state and private lands, because when the federal government is in control, you see declines, you see delays. What this
this boom has been great.
It's been great for workers. It's been great for consumers. People's energy bills are going down. It's been great for the environment by using more natural gas. CO2 emissions are at their lowest level in about 20 years. New York City has the cleanest air in 50 years because of affordable natural gas. But if you put the federal government in control of it, suddenly there's an extra hoop that producers would have to jump through in order to produce that energy.
Right now we have experiments. You have states like Vermont that are just as stupid as my state of New York. Both have banned, for now, frack. I mean, Vermont outlawed it. New York just has a moratorium that goes on forever.
The irony with Vermont, too, is that there is no oil and gas there to produce. There is no fracking going on there. So it's easy for them to come out and say, yes, we're going to ban fracking. 2 months after they did that, by the way, the governor stood in front of a gas processing facility and touted how this was going to deliver affordable and clean energy to the residents. So
where was he going to get the gas from? Other states?
It's either going to come in from other states where fracking is occurring, or it's going to come in imported from Canada. But if you look at some of these other states, you know, deep blue states like California and Illinois, they've rejected this ban fracking activism that's out there because they know there are huge economic benefits to this, and they know that a lot of these accusations, you like to say myths and even downright stupidity, a lot of these claims actually fall into those categories.
There's a case in Texas where the EPA inserted itself in the state case, and they said that fracking was to blame for bad water quality. It turned out the EPA official was colluding with an environmental group?
Yeah, there were, what had happened is the EPA stepped in and said that this house was at risk of exploding because of methane in the water. As it turned out, the methane that was in the water had nothing to do with gas drilling.
The guy's water did catch fire, but it turned out that the landowner had hooked his hose up to a gas vent.
Exactly, and some of his neighbors had actually drilled their water wells into a geologic formation that is producing the kind of gas that they found in the water. It had nothing to do with the drilling activity. The gentleman actually in question who made that order later had to resign from the EPA.
But we have a clip of why. He resigned after this video came out. He was caught saying he'd regulate the gas industry the way the Romans once conquered villages.
It was kind of like how the Romans used to conquer little villages and they crucified them. And then, you know, that town was really easy to manage for the next few years.
Crucify them.
Exactly. After that video came out, he resigned about a month later, and he now works for the Sierra Club, which is an environmental group that fittingly opposes fracking.
Of course, but why should we believe you? You're working for oil and gas companies.
Don't just take my word for it. Look at what the Obama administration has said about this. The EPA has said there's nothing inherently dangerous in fracking that sound engineering principles can't fix.
It won't convince the protesters, and here's what some of them say America should do instead of fracking.
Renewable energy would be best. Wind, solar.
There's a thing that's algae. There's more energy in algae than any other, source.
There's more energy in algae, and you shill for the oil companies just don't want to let the algae people sell their fuel.
Well, if you don't want to take the word from the oil and gas industry, take the word from the renewables companies and their associations. The wind industry has said that natural gas is a perfect complement to their growth. The point here is that if the renewables advocates really wanted renewables and weren't just interested in shutting down oil and gas, they would look at this and say, let's produce more gas because that's what's going to allow renewables to move forward and to grow into the future.
Finally, here's the latest anti-fracking scare. Injecting that liquid into the ground causes earthquakes.
A lot of people in the state of Oklahoma are demanding answers about a huge spike in the number of earthquakes there.
Oklahoma has had more than 100 earthquakes since Friday. Today's only Monday.
People want to know if fracking is to blame.
You're causing earthquakes.
Well, it's easy to blame anything on oil and gas in Oklahoma because 70 out of 77 counties actually have oil and gas production. So anything that happens could be blamed on that. This is one area where the media is getting it just dead wrong. They keep saying it's about
one
fracking.
area. We get it dead wrong all the time.
This has nothing to do with fracking. The National Academy of Sciences has said that fracking does not pose a credible risk of causing seismic events at all. This is wastewater disposal, which is a separate process. Blaming this on fracking would be like blaming a tire fire in a junkyard on Chevrolet.
And also, what it is isn't much. There have been more than 2,000 earthquakes. Only 400 were felt in any way. And what the Oklahoma Geological Survey says is that you barely feel it. If you're walking, you won't feel it. If you're sitting, you might.
These are small events. But it's always better to look at this in full context rather than just getting scared because someone put the F word, that sounds like something you wouldn't say to your grandmother, fracking, into a headline.
The F word and the E word, earthquakes. That gets your attention. Thank you, Steve. Coming up, the EPA today is a monster that takes people's freedom. But a man who helped form the agency says he has no regrets, and he's here to tell us why. Next. You ever see one of the Incredible Hulk movies? A mild-mannered scientist experiments with radiation, turn him into someone who becomes a monster when he gets angry. The EPA is kind of like that. And here in our studio is one of the real creators of the EPA monster, Jay Lair of the Heartland Institute. And you make no apologies.
None at all. Between 1968 and 1971, a half a dozen heads of professional societies helped the Bureau of Water Hygiene create US EPA. I worked on a variety of committees to write 6 very important laws that created a safety net for our environment.
Things like the Water Pollution Control Act, the Drinking Water Act. And I mean, I'm with you on this. That stuff was good because
it was definitely good. The government had no clue of how bad our environment is. Our air was terrible. People threw garbage into our water. Nobody was looking out for the way we mined chemicals or put chemicals on our agriculture, and we needed rules, and we passed them in the 70s. From the 80s on, we absolutely have done nothing of value.
Nothing of value from the 80s. Well, let's go back to the 70s, because even people who lived through the worst of the pollution that he's talking about, like us, often forget how polluted the air and water were. Here's a Walter Cronkite special that aired the first year I was a reporter.
Earth Day, a question of survival.
Act or die.
The clear days are fewer now. And instead of forever, the view often stops with haze. The air is threatened.
Welcome, sulfur dioxide. Hello, carbon monoxide.
And that's just in the air. The city's rivers offer a whole new dimension of pollution.
It was bad. Maybe not that bad. Some of that was network news hysteria. But the air was filthy. In some towns, people wouldn't open windows because soot would just pour in. We do forget how bad it was.
On June 21st, 1968, the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland caught fire when a spark came off a railroad car onto the polluted water. It was terrible, John.
But nothing useful after 1980? They've done nothing?
Nothing whatsoever. The Environmental Protection Agency
got 15,000 employees.
All just looking over the shoulder of the 50 states that do all of their bidding. The states is where the action is, and we should phase out EPA over a 5-year period and put all the responsibility in the hands of a committee of the whole. The 50 state agencies, move the offices from Washington, D.C. to Topeka, Kansas, save $6.2 billion, and improve environmental protection.
But previous guests talked about there's still air pollution in many places in the cities, people getting lung cancer and having asthma. I mean, you look at a magazine in this city, try not to breathe too much air today.
Well, that is absurd, but when I started in environmental science in the 60s, we could only measure a part per million, then a part per billion, 1,000 times smaller, then a part per trillion, now a part per quadrillion. The concentrations we measure are so small that we'll soon measure a molecule in a glass of water. Then we'll know there's a little bit of everything in every glass of water.
But the EPA says even these tiny amounts are killing people.
They're absolutely wrong. I mean, it's fraudulent. They're not at all. They're of no importance. None of their amendments have improved either our environment or human health. All they do is ruin our economy.
Today, people equate the threat of climate change with pollution. Here's Senator Barbara Boxer this summer.
We need to take action now to protect families and communities from the mounting impacts of climate change and dangerous carbon pollution. 3,700 cases of bronchitis in children, 150,000 asthma attacks, 3,300 heart attacks.
So she's just, I mean, maybe climate change is real, but it has nothing to do with heart attack.
Nothing at all. And you said it early on in the show. They're talking about carbon pollution. They should be talking about carbon dioxide. There's nothing in the atmosphere, John, that will allow carbon dioxide to be broken up into carbon and oxygen. So they're trying to scare people with a falsehood.
But wouldn't it be good to reduce carbon in the air, carbon dioxide?
Absolutely not. We're only on this planet because we have carbon dioxide and plants grow and we breathe. It's absurd to consider carbon dioxide a pollutant. It is not, but it's given the U.S. EPA an opportunity to run our lives.
Thank you, Jay Lair from the Heartland Institute, a think tank in the Midwest, which is unusual. Coming up, my next guest says we can clean America's lakes and rivers without the EPA. A better way to manage pollution. I'm critical of the green monster the EPA's become, but what else we got? Without the EPA, wouldn't polluters just pollute away? Lakes and rivers would be filthy. There'd be trash everywhere. That's how most of us think, but that's only because we don't really understand the power of private ownership, says Terry Anderson. Anderson's with a group in Montana called PERC, the Property and Environmental Research Center. So what does property have to do with the environment?
No one washes a rental car, John. When people own things, they take care of it. And when people have private property rights that they can enforce, other people can't dump their gunk onto the property. Long before the EPA was a glint in anyone's eye, property rights were dealing with pollution issues.
And you have a new book about this called Environmental Markets. But how does it work? I'm home and somebody pollutes my drinking water. What am I going to do about it without government?
What you can do about it is knock on the door of the people who did it and say cease and desist, or I'll get the courts to enforce my property rights. Here in Montana, for example, we had the company called the Anaconda Mining Company, copper mining company, and it ruled the state. And yet when it was discovered that their tailings piles were causing pollution onto the ranches that neighbored them, they were taken to court. They had to cease and desist and pay for the damages. They quickly took care of that problem.
They not only paid, they restored some of the land.
Absolutely. The burden was on them for the damage they caused.
I can see how you can sue an individual polluter like Anaconda Copper, but I can't see how this works for most air pollution. If my air is polluted, say here in New York City, the pollution probably comes from the west, from New Jersey, but I don't know which power plant or factory. I wouldn't know who to sue.
This property rights argument works well for more local issues. When it crosses state boundaries, it gets more difficult. The amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990 took on the problem of acid rain. It was sulfur being emitted from Midwestern power plants, creating acid rain in the Northeast. That's a place where it made sense to put some restrictions on. But even there, EPA understood the power of the marketplace and used a system whereby people could reduce their emissions of sulfur and sell the credits for that to other companies that couldn't reduce. We got much less sulfur emissions at a much lower price than standard EPA regulations get us.
But your market remedies, these are easier to do with water pollution than air pollution.
Absolutely. It's why we were cleaning up our water even before 1972 and the Clean Water Act. And now we've gone way overboard with the restrictions. Here in Montana, they're forcing small towns to clean up arsenic. Oh, my gosh, you think of the Agatha Christie novel of someone dying at the dinner table. But the arsenic's coming out of Yellowstone Park, the geysers, and it's in such small amounts it doesn't have any health effects. But cities are having to put the plants in place to clean this up, and there are cities that would be much better off getting a new ambulance.
How would this work for the oceans? People say it's a tragedy of the commons. No individual person cares about the fish in their area. You can't have private property making it better.
The arguments just have it backwards, really. What has happened in fishery after fishery, starting in places like New Zealand and Iceland, and now in some places in the U.S. and Central America, we've created individual fishing quotas which are tradable, which are bankable, which give people an incentive to invest in their fisheries. And these work very, very well where we have fisheries that are controlled by 200-mile limits, for example. The open oceans are much more like the air that we've just talked about.
But in those areas where they've legalized ownership, we now have more fish?
Oh, absolutely. It's phenomenal. When the fisheries regulators did what EPA did and said, we're going to regulate the season, we're going to regulate the number of boats, we're going to regulate the size of boats, and the list went on, all that happened was that people figured out ways around it because, as you said, it was a tragedy of the commons. Race out and get the fish while you can.
It made it a very dangerous catch.
Oh, it makes a good TV show called The Deadliest Catch. But now that we've created these individual, or where we've created them, we haven't done it everywhere, what has happened is fishing seasons have increased, numbers of boats have decreased, efficiency has improved, price of fish has gone down, and instead of eating fish sticks, we get fresh halibut. So it's a win-win, except for the regulators.
Thank you, Terry Anderson from the Property and Environment Research Center. Coming up, how the green monster should be restrained. We should shrink him down to the size of a small lizard. The EPA is a monster, but you could argue it's less of a monster than other government bureaucracies because the EPA has not constantly grown. They spend about $8 billion of your tax dollars every year, but that's actually a little less than they spent under President Bush. Good. However, the EPA is still a monster because its old rules never go away, but they keep passing new ones. It's always more. EPA officials point out that their budget's only $8 billion, only, that's Washington talk. But even the $8 billion is misleading because when the EPA says clean that up, the cost is on you. Last year, the EPA decreed every fuel seller must use more biomass like soybeans and diesel fuel. Cost the EPA little to demand that, but cost the fuel industry hundreds of millions to comply, and consumers will pay the extra cost when we buy fuel. Aside from cost, why, when the air and water are cleaner than they've been in years, and they keep getting cleaner because of improvements in technology, heck, the air gets cleaner every time someone buys a new car and junks an old one, why then must the EPA keep passing more rules? Because that's what government regulators do. If you're a bureaucrat and you're not passing rules, you think you're not doing your job. So it's always more. As Thomas Jefferson said, it's the natural progress of things for government to grow and liberty to yield. But it's worse with the EPA because think about who's likely to become an EPA bureaucrat. Environmental zealots, that's who. There's a revolving door between the EPA and environmental groups. Remember that EPA regulator who was caught bragging how he'd treat the oil industry the way the Romans once crucified people?
It was kind of like how the Romans used to, conquer little villages.
He resigned, but quickly found work at the Sierra Club. Others who once worked for the Sierra Club now work at the EPA. EPA bureaucrats are not dispassionate regulators. These are environmental zealots. And when they're in government, zealots have power over you. 16,000 people work for the EPA. Some are religious fanatics, and their religion is command and control until the earth is pure. Some are just jerks. Region 8 of the EPA sent out a memo to its employees saying, "Don't defecate in the hallway." The U.S. Inspector General found one EPA staffer spent 2 to 6 hours of his workday watching pornography. He downloaded 7,000 porn files. Guess he wasn't very busy, but the EPA paid him $125,000 a year and gave him bonuses, performance awards. Your government at work. I'm thankful to the EPA. Our lives are much better because they forced power plants to put scrubbers in smokestacks and forced car makers to make cars that pollute less. But now the EPA's work is largely done. Stick a fork in it. The pollution control rules already exist. America does need a few inspectors to enforce the rules we have. But we don't need more rules, and we don't need 16,000 environmental regulators constantly trying to control more of our lives. EPA should stand for enough protection already. That's our show. See you next week.